I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Today we speak about conscious parenting while facing collapse with therapist, expat environmental activist, and collapse-aware mother, Susan McMillan. All right, I'm particularly appreciative and excited about this episode of what up till recently, we've been roughly calling a collapse-aware parenting focused set of interviews and conversations as a parallel expression to the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And it's slowly but surely becoming a bit more artful in how it's showing up. There are about half a dozen of us now that are involved with this project, and of gathering these conversations, these interviews with people who are both aware of the many challenges and predicaments of our world and who are parents. And I have the great fortune today of speaking with one of the members of this production team, Susan McMillan. Susan, you've been a part of one type of living resilience or safe circle and the other kinds of things that are produced around here. You've been a part of many of the offerings for quite a while, and you bring a remarkable set of attributes or experience in my estimation to everything you touch. You and I are part of a pilot group with Jay Early in terms of what he calls the great turning groups of support groups that I think he's hoping to take it to quite a large scale, and looking for people like yourself and me and others that have some experience, yourself being a counselor for some period of time and also very collapse aware and also a parent. And so I'm just thrilled that you bring all of those things to this conversation, and your willingness to be one of the people interviewed for this parenting project, which we are now calling Take My Hand, Conscious Parenting in a Time of Collapse and Predicament. And so, Susan, welcome. It's so great to have you here, and so great to, I'm hoping to find out more about you than I've ever known, because we don't get to talk about these pieces very much. And so again, I just really appreciate you taking time and generously sharing about your perspective and your experience in what is a very unique challenge these days of being both collapse aware and a parent. So welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, because I've found so much peace and solace and ability to cope through my connection with you and the Safe Circle calls and the Living Resilience group that you did. And so that's why I'm even in a place to talk here with you today. So thank you, Dean.
Thank you. Well, a while ago, before we hit the record button, I was telling you about how some of these conversations have gone, and that oftentimes we end up starting with, what has a person grown up with in terms of what were the narratives or what were the stories that you grew up with, in terms of what is it to be an adult in this world. As we're kids growing up, we get these messages, many of them almost unspoken, about what is it to become an adult, and then somewhere in that path to become aware of what is it to become a parent. So I'm wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about what were some of the stories or images that you had as you were growing up about what would parenthood look like, or what would adulthood look like?
Yeah. So I was very fortunate, raised in a family that never had to struggle. Parents were happily married until my father died a couple years ago at age 93. Um, Lots of brothers and sisters. And education was always really important to my family, and so was a sense of patriotism.
Hmm.
And my idea about what it meant to be an adult was mixed with my idea about what it meant to be an American.
Hmm.
Um, it was this country that offered all this opportunity. Just a couple generations back, my ancestors were escaping tyranny in Germany and Russia, and came over here and to make a better life for their children. And it was my job and all my brothers and sisters' jobs to continue that legacy of making a quote unquote better life for our children with each generation. And that meant having a good education and being a doctor, lawyer, or Indian chief, basically. Also mixed with making your parents proud. So for my parents, they were, I always just got the message it was just expected that I was going to go to school, go to college, go to graduate school, be a professional, get a fantastic job, hopefully be a doctor, and be married, and have children, and be the president of the PTA, and do it all perfectly and look good while doing it, until I got to retire and then be a grandmother, and my children would do the same for me.
No pressure there.
No pressure. That was indeed the story.
Well, thank you for laying out that kind of family history, or the container you grew up in. And I've got to say, just by way of contrasting with my own life, you had an immense amount more pressure for performance and excellence than I did. And I don't have judgment about that. I'm just noticing, wow, it seems like a lot.
In fact, we just had a 90th birthday party for my mother, and everyone stood up and gave a speech, and they were thanking her for putting that kind of pressure on us. My brother gave the story about, he brought home 1B and all A's, and of course, the question was, what's the B in, instead of congratulations. And there were just lots of stories like that with great gratitude,
Mhm.
because on the one hand, it gave us many special skills, although there's certainly a downside that I've tried not to push that kind of pressure onto my kids. But yeah, we all did have that pressure to be excellent.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like with what you're describing, that recent family gathering, that it was mostly a really good thing.
It was.
And I'm in that way, I'm a bit envious as I was describing my own family background. But anyway, now if we shift gears to looking into what the world looks like now, with the passion for excellence aside, as something that it sounds like it really turned out in a gorgeous way in your family, I'm curious if you could give us a sense of how does it look to you now, this world that you're bringing your children up into. How is this world different?
Yeah.
And what parts of that family tradition are you inclined to bring along with you into your parenting now? And what aspects of the world are demanding something entirely different?
Well, when I was growing up, I don't know exactly where I got this from because it wasn't pushed on me by my parents, but I've always had a overly sensitive by this world's standards connection to nature.
Mm.
And when animals are hurt or a tree is being cut down, I've always just felt the pain of nature in my heart. Um, so even while I was doing all the things that I needed to do to excel in school and make my career, I always had a knowledge that what we were doing to the earth was wrong and not sustainable. I've always known that. And in my spare time, all of my passion and all of my hobbies have always centered around care for the environment. So I've always known that something was wrong, and and the older I got, and the more educated I became about the environment, about climate change, which I was onto about 20, probably in the mid 90s, I started to realize that that was going to be a problem. I have always just had this sense of dread and nightmares since I was a little girl, usually with the theme of a big tsunami coming, and not necessarily meaning a literal tsunami, but symbolic for that things are going to crash. So I've while I just have just considered it my responsibility to try to make the world a better place for my kids by working on any environmental issue that I could, and using whatever contacts I developed from the business world or skills that I've come upon to not just for my business and from earning an income, but to use it for the greater good of making the world a better place.
Yeah.
And I've been pretty good with that until this latest science has come out in the last year that there's no time for that. The kids, I had children and I thought I knew they would be being born into a world full of problems and environmental degradation, but I had not realized that the time was so short before things would all fall apart. So that's all relatively new information for me. I no longer, I always imagined one day I would be old and I would have grandchildren and they would sit on my lap and I would play with them. And now I don't expect to have grandchildren and I don't want to have them.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think the world is going to be a nice place for them if they get to be born. And so that's a very different scenario from how I grew up.
Yeah.
And it can't be talked about with my family. It can't be talked about with hardly anybody. It's the unspoken conversation that makes everybody either think that I'm crazy or no fun to be around. My kids, I raised them to, be the best they can, do something that they love. And now I'm telling them just in the last year, I'm sorry that the world that I told you it was going to be like is not going to be that way. It's going to be harder. And I don't know the future, so I can't say you won't be here. You'll be killed this way or that. I don't really know what. And I tell them I don't know what it's going to be like. And I hope that you'll be part of making it better, a new way, because the old way doesn't work. It's just unsustainable and destructive, and I'm pretty straightforward with them about that.
Yeah. Wow. So you've actually covered a couple of parallel topics that I didn't know we would get to, and I so appreciate you sharing about it. There's this pocket of loneliness that is the way that I describe my own experience, and so many of the people that I get to speak with, they share about the loneliness of not being able to speak about something that is so core to the experience of being a human being in these times, it literally is what matters most. It is the core issue or topic for conversation in our lifetime and in all of human history. And I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit about that. I forget exactly how you described it, but how unwelcome this conversation is in your own family, and it sounds like in your circles of friends as well. Could you
Yeah.
share a little bit more about how that shows up for you?
In my circle of friends in Florida, before I moved to Costa Rica, which is about 9 months ago, that was not something that was going to be discussed.
Mm-hmm.
I actually belonged, helped start what we called an intellectual discussion group. And we talked about life after death and politics and healthcare and race relations. Whenever I would push it towards climate change or the environment, I felt some resistance if I took it too far. And this is even before I was collapse aware. I just knew that things were very bad and that we could someday in the future, maybe the near future, reach that tipping point where climate change would be out of control and we'd never be able to go back. But I didn't think we were there yet.
Yeah.
And I remember the very last intellectual discussion group I went to, the topic was progress. And they're super wonderful people, educated, progressive people. And I felt like I was not on the same page with them in trying to get them to see that progress and growth and all this stuff we have is not turning out to be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument was, well, by definition, progress is good. And I was saying, well, that's what we've been taught, but that's a story. And if our values and morals aren't keeping up with our technology, it's not really progress. It's anti-progress as far as I'm concerned. But no, they weren't there with me.
Yeah.
My family, that I can't even explain the messages I get not to go there.
Mm.
Here in Costa Rica, I have found some more awareness,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm working on getting closer and closer with groups of people where I think we will be able to discuss this pretty openly sooner or later. But right now we just kind of flutter along the edges, and I'm testing out people's comfort level.
Yeah.
The place where I've found the most company has been online with your group and Jay's group and Jillian.
Yeah.
She and I are completely in sync. So thank goodness for the internet, although technology has brought its share of problems as well. But
Yeah.
that's where I've found that I can talk about it.
Yeah. I'm wondering if I could just ask kind of a slightly different layer of that same question. What I've been discovering in these conversations is that, yes, oftentimes we'll start the conversation including the topic of climate change or abrupt climate change as the starting point. But a question that I often ask is answered differently by almost every person, and that is, what are the main concerns that you have as you look out into the world that your children are walking into that may or may not be climate change? For instance, one guy that I recently interviewed, I've interviewed him before in a different context, and he's long had a focus on the rise of the far right and of fascism and of white nationalism and authoritarianism and so on. He's very aware of the climate stuff and the environmental predicaments that we're in. But really for him, that's even more immediate because he's aware of where he's living in the northwest of the USA. These are active factions of the US population. And so he's
Right.
very aware of that. That's how he would answer that question. And I'm curious if you would share, do you have a number of things that you are concerned about, particularly for your kids to be stepping into?
Well, certainly the United States is not the country that I thought that I grew up in.
Right.
Um, and I don't even know that I want to say that the country has changed, although it has. But I'm, considering our history of conquering and abusing Native Americans and enslaving African Americans, we're kind of just like par for the course.
Yeah.
Um, it's very disheartening to see the openness with the racism and the level of discourse sunken so low, and the propping up and excusing and even admiring the immorality of the president. It's just so disheartening that I feel bad for my children, or any children that are going to grow up and stay in that country. To me, um, and I'm sure there's beautiful, wonderful parts, but overall, it just seems like such an ugly place.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I'm getting too much from the news or from the town the area of Florida that I lived in. But we left Florida with my daughter, and one of the deciding factors was there was the Parkland school shooting, which was also in Florida.
Yes.
Shortly after that, in my daughter's school, which is called Manatee School for the Arts, where there's children that dance and do art, and it's a nice little town, and she spent 3 hours under her desk in lockdown because they thought they had an active shooter on the premises. And they solved the problem by posting an armed guard with an AK-47 at her door. And what I'm seeing in America is the normalization of all these things that are contrary to my value system. And we're making it normal. Like, well, sure, there's shootings at school. That's just a thing. We'll just get an armed guard and tell your kid not to be scared.
Mm-hmm.
When I mentioned this to my own mother, she thinks that I'm being silly to be fearful about my daughter going to school and getting shot. My daughter's afraid, and that's enough for me. So that was one of the factors. In my neighborhood, since Trump became president, there's been this move in our neighborhood where you have to have guns and you have to have the right to target practice in your yard. So I built this eco house, that overlooks the woods with a deck, and I like to sit out there. And now, or not now, but when I lived there last year, I would sit out there and literally listen to gunshots. On New Year's Eve, which was a month before we left the country, my husband and I stayed home, and we were in bed, and at midnight, not fireworks, gunshots started all over the neighborhood. Like, you couldn't possibly go outside without fear of a stray bullet getting you. And that's just becoming a new normal. So the level of violence, the level of discourse, the rise of white nationalism, the normalization of racism, those are all horrible things that I worry about for my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And climate change is even the bigger one.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I so appreciate you sharing about Florida. I had no idea. I mean, it's one thing if you live in the woods here in Southern Oregon. If you get out into the county that I worked for a while, in the cities, there's no way that anybody could be doing target shooting in their backyard. That's not the way it happens here in Oregon. But as soon as you get out into the county, into the more rural spaces, then yes, all bets are off.
Right.
And I was surprised to hear what you were sharing about Florida. And
yeah, And then our legislature passed a law signed by Rick Scott that a private community or city council or a neighborhood association cannot pass any laws restricting your gun use.
Hmm.
So even as a, you know, as an association, we couldn't say no more target practice.
Right. Wow. Okay.
Makes head spin.
Yeah. It starts to make more and more sense why I'm talking to you in Costa Rica.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where it sounds like by comparison, what you have to distract yourself with is the occasional saw next door and that kind of noise. So good. I'm curious with your obvious sensitivities that you've just been sharing to the issues that concern you in your communities, either the ones that you were living in before or the one you're in now, and globally. What that implies to me, especially to someone as knowledgeable as yourself, you know, you're a therapist in your line of work, you've got to have some substantial self-regulation skills. And for anybody who's watched this podcast or been in the programs that I offer here, the word self-regulation shouldn't be very foreign. It's in, you and I both had some conversations recently with Joe Brewer, and I appreciated so much in that recent conversation that I had with him when I asked him, what kind of skills would people be wise to have if they wanted to engage in the kind of communities and the kind of regenerative designed structures for a community that he's so involved with? What kind of personal skills would people be wise to have if they wanted to engage with these new groupings, these new gatherings or ways of people moving forward together? And his quick answer was advanced self-regulation skills and psychological flexibility. So we may or may not have time to go into the whole psychological flexibility conversation. I think he was implying quite a deep conversation, and that's, you know, perhaps for a different day and a different type of conversation. I'm curious, however, if you would be willing to share with us what you personally do to keep yourself in good shape, psychologically, emotionally, psychospiritually. And I'm also curious if you have any practices or rituals on the level of your family or friends as you get together that you share with one another to keep yourselves open-hearted, to keep yourselves in that kind of, I like to call it a resilience zone of being able to be present in the face of larger and larger scale stressors, and having a larger and larger capacity to be present when those around you are stressing out. Have you got anything to share with us about that kind of stuff?
Well, I feel like I'm kind of cheating almost, because it's much easier to self-regulate here in Costa Rica.
Yeah.
We are away from the rat race. We're away from all the cars and all the traffic and all the shopping and all the Walmarts and Kmarts and Publix and plastic bags and
Yeah.
Gunshots. And we're in a quiet town where the people care about the environment, and it's changing, but for the most part are living in harmony with nature.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to self-regulate here.
Mm.
2 weeks ago, I took my husband and I took my daughter and her friend to a permaculture farm. in the mountains of Costa Rica, probably over close to where Joe Brewer was staying.
Hmm.
And we stayed with this couple that is pretty much completely isolated, growing their own food and just living day by day with the sun as their alarm clock, and
Hmm.
you know, the sounds of the birds to tell them when it's time to time to wake up or time to have dinner.
Hmm.
Um, very slow, quiet life, but they taught us about the work they're doing with the soil, and we learned a lot about what modern agriculture has done to quality of the soil and ultimately to the climate.
Yep.
And they taught us about what they knew about permaculture practices, which is where the way that we do farming now is we go in and we say, well, here I want to plant this and here I want to plant that. And so I'll need this fertilizer and I'll need this pesticide and I'll need to bring in this type of soil or this type of chemical. And with permaculture, you say, okay, what do I have here? What will grow here? And you kind of just start with what you have. And when there's a problem, instead of turning to something unnatural like chemicals to kill the bugs, you say, well, what sort of animal will eat these bugs? Or what sort of plant will compete to take the bugs away? And so it's a whole way of thinking that just makes so much sense to me that I don't understand why the whole world isn't thinking like that.
Yeah.
It's also about not just about growing food, but about how a community operates, where people contribute instead of this rugged individualism and me, and this is mine. It's like, what am I willing to share? What skills do I have that I can offer? How can we work together as a community so that everybody's taken care of? And if there's going to be any way forward, it's going to have to be based on principles like that.
Yeah.
So I was happy to expose my daughter and her friend to it. And I sat around the dinner table and I said, what have you learned from being here? How do you think this applies to your future? And she gets it. And she's 16. So I'm feeling good about her understanding what sort of skills she's going to have, she's going to go into.
Hmm.
For self-regulation,
Susan,
I run.
if I could
Yes,
just
the sun.
if I could just stop you for a second. Two things. When you just mentioned that interaction with your daughter and her response, you froze up, so I didn't hear what that response was. So if I could have you just go back and start there. And then secondarily, the sun is sneaking up on you again, and I'm wondering, are you on a laptop?
Yes.
You know, if you don't mind, you could actually stand up, and I think it's going to give you plenty of time, and you might be able to get away with.
I think I can.
Wow. Well, there you go. Never mind. Never mind my small ideas. That's perfect.
I'm gonna I'll be holding it out with my arm. So let me see if I can get something to set it on.
Okay.
Get the dog out of the way. Move my one of our 3 rescue dogs. Okay. How's that?
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks for catching that.
Yeah. So if you wouldn't mind, you were just talking about how your daughter had a response to kind of what your question is like, why aren't we all living like this? And I think she had said a response to that.
She did. She completely agreed. I was surprised at how open she was to grasping and hopefully internalizing the lessons or the practices that we learned at the farm. And she was also like, yeah, I don't know why we're not all living like this. And she totally got it. She knows that her future is uncertain. She knows that she's going to need skills for whatever comes next. And fortunately, she doesn't have this, oh, I have to I have to go to college and I have to get a degree and I have to do this. She's pretty flexible. She wants to do art and she wants to write. And I'm just going to support her in living her dreams out as best she can.
Yeah. Could I ask, it looks like you actually have already done it just a moment ago. I was going to ask you to tilt your screen down just a little bit so there's a little less space above your head. Yeah, something like that. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, I particularly appreciate what you were just sharing about how you're orienting your plans for or your support of your daughter having a life that sounds like it was like extremely different than what you grew up in.
Right.
You grew up in that flow of you're going to become a doctor or a lawyer or something big time accomplishment and so on. That you articulated that back at the beginning of our talk, and now it's pretty obvious that you're responding to a very different world. And it's somehow you've allowed yourself to kind of shake loose those plans or expectations that you might have grown up with yourself. It sounds like you're not bringing much of that along for your parenting of your own daughter.
That's correct. Yeah, I'm not bringing that along. I do wish that I could give her a clear picture of what her world is going to look like, but I can't. I do tell all my kids, whenever the conversation goes towards how bad things are for their future, I always try to say to them, my generation and the generation before me screwed it up. And if there's any hope, it's you guys. And I don't want to put pressure on them like I've always felt that, well, Susan, you better save the world because nobody else. I don't want them to feel that way, but I really would like them to have the sense of agency that they can make a difference.
Yeah.
That is the only hope is the next generation. That people in power now aren't going to do it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm on the same page. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to make them feel pressured by it because I know what that's like. But I do want to kind of nudge them as an elder that they look up to, that you have the power to make a difference. I don't want them to feel helpless. And it's easy to feel helpless.
Mm-hmm.
When you were asking what techniques I use, and I started to say I run, the other thing that I do and I've always done is to find some sort of environmental project or problem that I can bring something to the table to make a difference and then go do it.
Yeah.
Even if it's small time in the big picture, that gives me, it takes my mind off the things that are hopeless.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I don't want to do? We had a beach cleanup last week.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I couldn't be on the group.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, we had 50 to 75 people cleaning up the beach. And we were out there for hours and you couldn't finish. And it was very disturbing to work so hard and collect so many bags of plastic and look behind you and no one could finish. I mean, we made an improvement, but and knowing that everything that we picked up in the next tide, it's going to be back anyway. That was pretty discouraging.
Yeah.
I was telling my husband, I said, if anybody that ever takes on a project, you have to be able to see your progress or it'll burn you out.
Yeah.
It was a very discouraging beach cleanup as far as I was concerned. But that could just be the perfectionism and like, I want it all.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I want them to feel like they can actually do something and make a difference.
Yeah. Really good. I'm so curious in your practice as a therapist. I'm curious if you have much demand for help with folks who are grappling with these issues that we're talking about today. Are these common presenting concerns for people that you work with, or is it more traditional family or personal issue dynamics and issues that you end up speaking with them about?
Well, it's so funny that you should ask that, because I'm involved in a group in Florida, Therapist Council for Environmental and Economic Justice. And we are developing an online course, which is part of what I do for my is offer online courses for therapists and healthcare providers. And we're writing one on how to help clients who are experiencing, for lack of a better word, eco grief, eco anxiety. And so we're working on that now. And we were just talking this morning that 99.9% of clients are not coming in identifying that as a problem.
Yeah.
But we open the door without feeling like we're pushing our agenda on them. How do we let them know that just as a human being, to have the natural world fall apart and not have access to nature, and to know that there's all these disasters happening that we're a part of, you know that on some level, although there's many different forms of denial to suppress it. But how do we open that door with our clients? And so we were discussing that. And we came up with, you know, when we hear some openings, like they talk about traffic or sprawl, or, you know, that can open the door. So no, our clients are not identifying it. And we, as therapists in my group, are working on a way to help them identify it and then deal with it. But what I think I really want to emphasize in the course is that when clients come in with this anxiety and grief, that's not a mental illness, and that's not an abnormal reaction to the world falling apart. Or the part that's ill is the culture, not the client.
Right.
And I'm going to find a way to try to get that message through in the course.
Great.
I think therapists need to start thinking about that.
Yeah, I would be very interested in having some more conversations with you, perhaps on the regular podcast side of what we do here, to talk about exactly that, because there's I'm also putting together a number of what I call learning series for people to engage with on the website. And I'm also in frequent conversation with mental health professionals about exactly what you're talking about. So I'm hoping that you and I can connect about that. And I'd love to get the word out, you know, once you've got your offerings up and ready to participate with. I'd love to get the word out for you. So let me know. And perhaps another place we could talk would be in the Deep Adaptation forum about coaching, counseling, course leading, facilitation. That's the part of the Deep Adaptation forum that I'm a moderator in. Perhaps we could ask you to come in and talk about the nature of what you're putting together, this online coursework and so on. It seems like a really important conversation. So I don't mean to take away too much from what we're talking about right now, but I'm very excited about what you're putting together.
Yeah, it's exciting.
So Susan, you've I knew that you would be remarkably articulate about each element of this conversation. You know, this is not a new conversation. This is not new territory. You've been mapping this out for quite some time, longer than most. I'm curious if you would have a way of wrapping up this conversation that we're having today with any any sort of um, completion message that you could offer to people who are newer to these conversations than you are, and still parents, still concerned in their own way, but many of the things that you talk about so easily and with such facility, is there anything you could offer to folks who are newer to these conversations, perhaps struggling a bit? Anything that you would suggest as a way to finish up this conversation here?
I I found so much help on your website. It was the first time when I stumbled across that. I remember listening to one of the podcasts and saying, I've never heard this before. I thought this was only in my head that things were so bad and that people could discuss it. So having a place where other people are aware is tremendously helpful. That's made all the difference in just wanting to curl up and cry. And then in the course that you offered, there were so many tools, so many things to ponder and think about and meditate on. And I just found it to be a roadmap to finding some peace. And so, we're living in this time of such massive uncertainty. But then again, it's not the first time that humans have lived with uncertainty. If you've ever lived by a volcano or lived when when the Holocaust was coming, I mean, if you live in an inner city, if you live in these countries where Guatemala or Nicaragua, or people are trying to escape, parents are going through these kind of things that are worse than what we're going through. And I get scared about the future because we are so privileged and we are safe and there's no fire, hurricane, storm, flood, nuclear explosion happening right now. But it hangs over my head that could happen and what will happen to my children. And how much do I want to talk about that? Because I don't want to scare them and I want them to enjoy life and feel like they have a future, and I don't want to put my fears on them. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't have the answers. These are just things that I think about, and to have other people to bounce it off with and hear what they think, I find helpful and healing.
I will be sure to put a number of links to the work here at livingresilience.net, and also the podcast of Poetry of Predicament and safecircle and these learning series that are getting birthed very soon. I'm also curious if you yourself have any links that you would like to invite people to be in touch with you, or offerings that you would suggest, or other people's work that you found immensely valuable. Anything that you'd like to mention here, I'm happy to include as well. Anything come to mind?
Only what the resources that you've given me.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But when our online course is up and ready, I'll definitely send it to you and see what you think.
Well, yeah, and let's get you on. Actually, any time in anticipation of that you would like to do a podcast, just to let me know, and we'll set that up. But especially when it's up, don't hesitate, and we will get that word out. Again, I think I said most of this before we hit the record button. I'm feeling really honored that you have said yes to being a part of the production team putting together this special series of interviews with people with something to say about the extraordinary predicaments we find ourselves in, and also just how extraordinary it is to be a parent in the face of all that. And you are just a ridiculously articulate person to be able to map out what's it like? How can one do it? Just to be able to share as generously as you have here about what's been working for you, and yet what you're still very, very concerned about, and how that's changed you as an adult and also as a parent. It was particularly remarkable for me to hear how you've changed what you grew up in to how that shows up now in your parenting style with your own children. So, Susan McMillan, thank you so much for taking this time to share what the world looks like from your perspective.
Thank you, Dean. It's my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.